Hello, my name is Sarah. I'm 16 years old and I hate my mom. Because my mother hates me and thinks that I am a terrible person. But I'm positive that I did nothing wrong. Mom believes that I am a girl with low morals who lacks social responsibility. In reality, she said something much worse. I'm just trying to put it nicely. As if her offensive words were not enough, I also had to comply with my mother's terrible ideas for how to turn me into a good girl. All this because I defiled my grandpa's funeral, taking a moment to be alone with my boyfriend. So my story began with the death of my grandpa. Of course, this was a sad event, but I hardly knew Grandpa. When I saw him for the last time, I was still a little girl. So I was not overwhelmed by grief, but my mother was. When my grandpa had suffered from a stroke, which became the cause of his death later, my mother left me alone and moved across the country from the north to the south to stay with him. Of course, her concern for Grandpa was understandable, but before that, Mom did not communicate with him at all. No greeting calls for birthdays, no packages with presents for Christmas, nothing. I don't think that there was any kind of hostility between my mom and my grandpa. They both had a rather cold indifference toward each other. As soon as Mom had learned about his stroke, she rushed to the clinic where Grandpa was treated. She found out for herself that he was in terrible shape and took a plane back to get days off to be able to take care of Grandpa for a long time. But while she settled everything at her work, Grandpa died. I had never seen my mother like this. She cried. She literally tore her hair out and blamed herself for everything. Mom called herself a terrible, inattentive, and ungrateful daughter and got obsessed with the idea that the only way to make amends for Grandpa, at least a little, was to organize a wonderful funeral ceremony for him. To do this, she decided by all means to get all of our relatives together who were scattered from Hawaii to Connecticut. I became the first victim of my mother's repentance plan. I was torn from the usual routine of my life for almost a week. I had to leave school, and I love my school. Not because of studies, of course, but because of my friends. I had to give up all my plans for the upcoming days to fly down south together with my mother. I wanted to stay at a hotel because I felt uncomfortable staying in a place where somebody had just recently died, but my mother insisted that we would stay at Grandpa's house. And then she began to tell me numerous stories from her childhood and from Grandpa's younger years and show me all kinds of old things. It was very tiring. I do not want to sound selfish, but I did not understand how this was related to me. I was sorry that Grandpa had died. I sympathized with my mother, but all I wanted was to have a few days of rest and, of course, go back home. And when our numerous relatives started to arrive, it only got worse. They all supported this hypocritical mourning atmosphere, although most of them, just like me, had only seen Grandpa just a couple of times. My only salvation was Carl. He was my very distant cousin. He was several years older than me, and before Grandpa's funeral, we hardly knew each other. Carl was stuck in exactly the same hopeless situation as I was. We were the only ones who were about the same age in this crowd of relatives, so we quickly found common ground. Every morning, Carl and I ran away from the others, chatted about everything in the world, and played games on his tablet together. Of course, if only anybody from the adults would have found us, we would have been scolded for inappropriate behavior, but it was fun. And soon Carl and I found out that we were going to be stuck in this place for a long time. The thing was that after my grandpa's death, my mother accused the clinic where he was treated of negligence. It seemed that my mother was going to sue them, trying to prove that Grandpa failed to recover from a stroke because of mistreatment. Of course, there wasn't a chance that she'd win the case, but the charges triggered some kind of investigation. And now we could not get Grandpa's body for the funeral. Can you imagine? Relatives arrived, everything needed for the ceremony was arranged and paid for. Everything was prepared so that we could all mourn at dear Grandpa's grave, but there was nothing to put in it. Forgive me for my black humor. It was Carl who helped me see the situation from this angle and to come to terms with all this. Now the funeral was postponed for an unknown number of days. Mom did not let any of the relatives go home, so the atmosphere became more and more tense. Then I realized that I had some feelings for Carl. I don't know how it turns out, but if you find yourself in a confined space with a nice guy, you might have some kind of chemistry with him. I did not have a boyfriend, so I did not see anything wrong if something were to happen between us. The only thing I did not know at all was how to make Carl understand that I had started to look at him as not just a witty and cool friend. Fortunately, or maybe on the contrary, unfortunately, Carl was a smart guy and read my emotions very well. And he took the first opportunity that we were left alone to use the situation to our mutual benefit. It was the day when Mom planned a new funeral ceremony. No one was sure that we would be able to get Grandpa's body this time, but my mother forced everyone to put their mourning clothes on, forced all the hired staff to work again, and even rented a farewell hall. Mom was very busy with all these chores and finally forgot about me, but Carl did not. He took my hand and dragged me into the neighboring mourning hall, which seemed closed at this time. There were a lot of coffins, fortunately empty, so the sight of dead people did not spoil our newly born romantic mood. Carl started kissing me. It was a wonderful 10 minutes of my life, but then our hideout was discovered by a hired funeral hostess. I do not know what this vile voyeur thought, but she did not interrupt Carl and I, and we were so passionate about each other that we did not notice her. But my mother made sure we noticed her when the hostess brought her into this room. Oh, before this moment, I did not know that my mom was able to scream so loudly. And for some reason, she only yelled at me, which allowed Carl to safely retreat. I was at a loss, so I hardly resisted when my mother grabbed me by my morning dress collar and dragged me back into the hall. After that, she continued to yell at me and call me bad words in front of the crowd of our relatives. We avoided an even bigger drama only because Grandpa's body had finally arrived, so the old man did do something good for me after all. On the next day, our relatives started to depart, and Carl, too, had to leave. I understood that after this indecency, he would probably feel uncomfortable talking with me in the presence of others, so I was glad that he had managed to leave me his phone number. I really had some feelings for this guy, and was seriously hoping that he could become my boyfriend. Mom did not talk to me for several days. Basically, we didn't talk to each other until we flew back home. And then my mom repeated everything she was thinking about me once again. I no longer wanted to listen to these insults, so I just ran off to my room and slammed the door loudly. The next day, I found out that I was under house arrest. Mom was still on vacation, so she decided to take me to school and pick me up right after class. I was burning with shame, but I just did not know what to do with it. Also, I no longer had access to the internet. My mother set a new password, which I could not figure out. She also took my smartphone from me, replacing it with some kind of ancient mobile phone, so I lost Carl's number and couldn't text him. I had to endure all this for my supposedly shameless and indulgent behavior. But my mother herself understood that all these restrictions were ineffective. Several weeks passed, and I had the opportunity to eavesdrop on one of my mother's conversations. She rarely talked to anyone on the phone, so I guessed that this was probably important. And then I heard that my mother was going to send me to a private boarding school. I was so shocked that I immediately gave myself away and demanded an explanation from my mother. Mom calmly confirmed everything to me. Yes, she had chosen a good and, most importantly, a for-girls-only school for me. Everything was already arranged, and she just had to make the first installment payment for me to start studying there. I tried to protest. I loved my school. I loved my friends. I didn't want to go to some terrible institution surrounded by barbed wire. But my mother just repeated all those nasty things about me that she considered to be true and added that the girls' school would only do me good. At the end of our conversation, she reminded me that I was a minor and that I could not go against her. But I decided to try. I was a minor, right, but I already had a driver's license, and Mom had an old car in the garage, which she had been planning to sell for a long time. At night, I took a few things, got out of the house, and just drove away from this place. I had Carl's address. He lived in a neighboring state, so I went to see him. I drove all night and all day, and by the next night I managed to find Carl's house. I could not warn him about my visit, so I decided to surprise him. But a surprise was awaiting me at Carl's house. Instead of the boyfriend of my dreams, a pretty young girl opened the door for me. And unlike me, she was not his cousin. It turned out that Carl wasn't single. When he found out the reason for my visit, he got so mad that he personally phoned my mother and told her to come and pick me up. My escape failed and my heart was broken. Returning home in the backseat of the car, I realized that I would not be able to avoid the private boarding school, and I told my mother that I hated her, and my mom told me the same.